London, 1666. A city that had just survived the Black Death, only to face a darker fate. While King Charles II celebrated his return to the throne, the city was a ticking time bomb. Narrow streets choked with timber, warehouses filled with oil, and a summer so dry that the wood was ready to explode. One spark. That was all it took. And on this fateful night, the question wasn't if London would burn. The question was this the wrath of God or the folly of man?
Step into the shadow of the medieval city. Unlike the grand boulevards of modern London, the city in the 1600s was a suffocating forest of wood. Architects of the time built with a fatal flaw known as jettying. This meant each upper floor projected out further than the one below. By the third story, houses from opposite sides of the street would nearly touch, blocking out the sun and turning the narrow alleys into wind tunnels. But wood alone does not make an inferno. Nature itself seemed to be conspiring against the city. You see, London had been suffering under a merciless drought for 10 long months. The usual damp fog of the Thames was gone, replaced by a dry, dusty heat that cracked the earth. The thatched roofs of the poor, usually moist with rain, had turned into brittle straw. The entire city was essentially a pile of kindling, baked under the sun, just waiting for a spark. And what defenses did they have? Laughably primitive. There were no fire engines as we know them, only leather buckets passed hand to hand in frantic chains and crude devices called fire squirts that looked more like oversized medical syringes than hoses. Their only real strategy was destruction. They used long iron poles called fire hooks to pull down burning houses, hoping to create a gap that the flames couldn't cross. But in a city packed this tight, destruction was too slow. Now combine this helplessness with what lay by the river. Here, the warehouses were not filled with gold, but with the fuel of empire. Tons of hemp, barrels of oil, tallow for candles, and thousands of gallons of brandy, sitting unguarded in the sweltering heat. Yet the people slept soundly. You must understand the mindset of a Londoner at this time. They had just survived the Great Plague only a year prior. To them, death came from invisible miasma, not from fire. They believed their city was eternal. Even as a strong easterly wind began to howl through the spires of St. Paul's Cathedral, carrying the scent of smoke from a small bakery on Pudding Lane, nobody panicked. They simply turned over in their beds, unaware that they were sleeping inside a furnace intended for them all. Amidst the smoke and the screaming, we find one man. Not a king fighting for his throne, not a soldier fighting for glory, but a clerk. His name is Samuel Pepys, and through his eyes, or rather through the ink of his diary, we see the fire not as a statistic, but as a human tragedy. His story begins with a moment we can all understand: denial. At 3 a.m, his maid, Jane, woke him up. She pointed to a red glow in the distance. Pepys looked out the window, rubbed his sleepy eyes, decided the fire was far enough away, and went back to bed. It is a chilling detail. While the fuse of London was burning, history's greatest witness simply rolled over and went to sleep. But when he woke again later that morning, the world had changed. He walked to the Tower of London and looked out over the city. What he saw broke his heart. It wasn't just the burning buildings that moved him, it was the small things. He wrote beautifully and tragically about the pigeons. He watched them as the poor birds, loath to leave their homes, hovered about the windows and balconies. They circled closer and closer to the heat until their wings burned, and they fell down into the flames. In those falling birds, Pepys saw the stubbornness of London itself, clinging to their homes until the very end. As the fire roared closer to his own home on Seething Lane, panic set in. And here we see the absurdity of human nature. If you had 10 minutes to pack before your house burned down, what would you save? Gold, documents, family heirlooms. Pepys did save his gold, yes, but in his frantic state, he ran into his garden and dug a hole. In that hole, he buried his most prized possessions to keep them safe from the heat: his bottles of wine and a wheel of expensive Parmesan cheese. It sounds funny to us now, but in the face of the apocalypse, sometimes we cling to the smallest comforts of life. By evening, Pepys took to the River Thames. The water was choked with boats. Lighters and barges were piled high with furniture. He described the river as full of goods swimming in the water. Musical instruments, virginals and chests floating aimlessly downstream. The wind was blowing so hard it scattered flakes of fire like rain. Pepys wrote that he saw drops of fire falling all over the city, turning the night sky into a bloody arch of light. And as he looked at the faces of the people in the boats, he saw no fighting, no looting, just a silent, tearful, stunned resignation. The city was dying, and there was nothing left to do but watch.
While Samuel Pepys buried his cheese and the city slept, fate was already sealing London's doom. It began not with an explosion, but with a whisper. Pudding Lane, the king's baker, Thomas Fariner, believed he had put out his ovens for the night, but deep inside the ash, one single ember refused to die. At 1 in the morning, the Fariner family awoke to the smell of smoke. They were trapped upstairs. Desperate, they climbed out of a window onto a neighbor's roof. All of them escaped, except one, their maid. Too terrified to jump, she stayed behind in the heat. She became the first victim, the first sacrifice to the beast that was now awake. Even then, the city could have been saved. The neighbors woke up, the parish constables arrived. They saw flames licking at the timber walls and suggested the only logical solution: demolish the surrounding houses to create a fire break. But the homeowners refused. They worried about the cost of repairs, and so they waited for the mayor. Enter Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor of London. Summoned from his bed, he arrived irritated and tired. He looked at the burning bakery, he looked at the dry timber houses next to it, and then he delivered the most infamous words in the history of British incompetence. Pish, a woman might piss it out. With that arrogance, he turned his back on the fire and went home to sleep. He did not know it then, but as he walked away, the wind from the east began to pick up. The spark had become a flame. The flame was about to be hell. Sunday morning. The sun rose, but no one saw it. It was hidden behind a wall of black smoke that stretched for 50 miles. The fire was no longer just burning, it was hunting. Driven by a gale-force wind from the east, the flames didn't just crawl from house to house, they jumped. arches of fire, hundreds of feet long, leapt over entire streets, igniting warehouses before the people inside even knew they were in danger. The sound was the most terrifying part. Survivors described it not as a crackle, but as a deafening roar, like 1,000 thunderclaps happening at once. The heat was so intense it created its own weather system, a firestorm sucking oxygen out of the air, making it hard to even breathe, standing blocks away. Panic took hold, but the panic quickly turned to madness. As the city burned, a dark paranoia spread. The French did this, the Dutch did this. Mobs began to roam the streets, turning on anyone who sounded foreign. An innocent French watchmaker was singled out by the crowd, and later suspicion settled on a man named Robert Hubert, despite evidence to the contrary, even though he wasn't even in London when the fire began. The fire was destroying buildings, but fear was destroying the people's humanity. The mayor had vanished, the bucket chains had broken. The only escape was the river, but even the Thames offered no safety. The reflection of the fire turned the water the color of blood. Boats were packed so tight they couldn't move, and sparks rained down on them, setting the furniture in the barges on fire. London was trapped, caught between a wall of flame and a river of blood.
With the city on its knees, finally, leadership arrived. King Charles II, defying all protocol, rode into the streets. Covered in soot, he didn't just watch from a safe distance. Witnesses were stunned to see the monarch himself, ankle-deep in mud, passing leather buckets of water alongside the poorest laborers, handing out gold guineas to the workers. He and his brother James took command. They realized that water was useless. To kill the beast, they had to starve it. The order was given, bring the gunpowder. The sound of the fire was now joined by the boom of artillery. Soldiers began blowing up entire blocks of houses to create firebreaks. It was a desperate, brutal surgery. London was destroying itself to save itself. But the fire was faster. It raced towards the one place everyone thought was safe.
St. Paul's Cathedral, the medieval giant, the stone fortress of God. Merchants had filled its crypts with their books and cloth, believing the thick stone walls would protect them. They were wrong. The cathedral was undergoing repairs, surrounded by wooden scaffolding. The scaffolding caught fire first, then the timber roof beams, and then the unthinkable happened. The roof of St. Paul's was covered in acres of lead. The heat became so extreme that the lead began to melt. Witnesses watched in horror as a shimmering silver river of molten lead poured down from the roof. It cascaded down Ludgate Hill, glowing, white hot, consuming the cobblestones. The stones of the cathedral exploded like grenades, and with a crash that shook the earth, the great roof collapsed. God's house had fallen. Wednesday morning brought a strange gift. The wind dropped. The fire, having eaten everything in its path, finally began to starve. As the smoke cleared, 80% of London was gone. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, all turned to ash. The roar was gone, replaced by a silence loud enough to break a soul.
When the smoke finally lifted on Thursday, the silence returned. But this was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a blank canvas. London was gone. In its place stood a vast, smoking wasteland of ash and charcoal. Yet, amidst the ruins, a small miracle was found. Sir Christopher Wren, the great architect, was walking through the debris of the old St. Paul's. He asked a workman to bring him a flat stone to mark a spot for the new altar. The man brought back a broken piece of a gravestone. On it was a single Latin word, untouched by the flames, Resurgam, meaning, "I shall rise again." And it rose. King Charles II made a decree that changed history. No more wood. If London was to live, it had to be built of brick and stone. Out of the ashes stepped the visionaries. Men like John Evelyn and Christopher Wren presented plans to turn London into a new Rome. They dreamed of wide, straight boulevards, magnificent piazzas, and a grid system to replace the medieval maze. It was a beautiful dream. Perhaps too beautiful. The merchants of London were practical men. They refused to give up their land for boulevards. They wanted their shops back exactly where they were before. So the old street plan remained, but the skin of the city had changed forever. Gone were the pitch-covered hovels. In their place rose thousands of neat red brick houses, uniform and sturdy. The streets were widened just enough to stop fire from jumping, and a new profession was born. Men like Nicholas Barbon began selling fire insurance, and the first organized fire brigades were formed. London had learned its lesson. But bricks require laws. In a normal city, disputes over land would have tied up the courts for decades, leaving the ruins untouched. But London created the fire courts, a tribunal that moved with lightning speed, settling disputes in days, not years. It was a legal miracle that matched the architectural one. But the crowning glory of the new city rose slowly, stone by stone, on Ludgate Hill. It took Wren 35 years to complete his masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral. Instead of the old wooden spire, Wren gave London a massive dome of white Portland stone, a beacon of reason and science shining white against the grey sky. It stood taller than any other building, looking down over a city that had conquered its own death. London was no longer a medieval relic. It was now the first modern metropolis. Looking back at 1666, we are left with a haunting paradox. For the religious zealots of the time, the fire was God's punishment for a sinful city. Yet consider this, the fire showed no mercy to the holy. It consumed 87 churches and the great Cathedral of St. Paul. Meanwhile, the notorious brothels of Southwark, sitting safely across the river, remained untouched. If this was divine judgment, it was a strange judgment indeed. But perhaps there was a different kind of mercy at work, a mercy disguised as destruction. For centuries, London had been rotting. Its wooden heart was infested with rats, fleas, and the lingering bacteria of the Black Death. The fire was brutal, yes, but it acted as a cauterization. It sterilized the city. It burned away the filth, the rats, and the plague pits forever. London never suffered a major outbreak of the Black Death again. The fire that killed the city was also the cure that saved its future. Today, if you walk through the streets of London, you are walking through the ghost of 1666. Every brick building, every fire hydrant, every insurance policy in your pocket is a child of that inferno. The Great Fire marked the end of the medieval mind and the birth of the modern metropolis. It taught us that nature cannot be bargained with. it can only be respected. London rose from its ashes, stronger than before.
But history has a habit of repeating itself. While London learned to tame the fire, across the ocean, another empire was growing arrogant. A city of gold and marble, sleeping under the shadow of a mountain, or perhaps sitting on a fault line. The year is changing, the location is changing, but the arrogance remains the same. If you want to witness what happens when that mountain wakes up, make sure you are subscribed. I am Kang. This is History Reborn.